Tittle, the 1958 forbidden archaeology discovery that made Antarctica off-limits script. What if everything you were taught about human history was wrong? Not slightly wrong. Not we missed a few details wrong, catastrophically, deliberately, irreversibly wrong. In 1513, a Turkish admiral drew a map of a coastline that, according to every history book ever printed, no human being had ever seen. A coastline buried under 2 miles of ice. A coastline that wouldn't be officially discovered for another 300 years. Modern satellite imaging confirmed it. The map was accurate, so who drew it first? In 1958, Soviet geologists punched through 4 kilometers of Antarctic ice and found mountains. Mountains that should have been worn smooth by 100 million years of glacial pressure. Mountains that looked like they had been buried last Tuesday. The same year those mountains were found, 12 nations rushed to sign a treaty. A treaty locking Antarctica away from independent researchers, from archaeologists, from anyone asking the wrong questions. What were they trying to keep frozen? Because here is the question that will keep you awake tonight. What if Antarctica isn't a continent that lost its civilization? What if it is the civilization? The air in Antarctica doesn't just carry cold. It carries something older than cold. A silence so absolute, so weaponized, that it feels less like weather and more like a warning. When the wind stops, as it occasionally does in those brief, eerie windows between storms, you can hear the ice shifting beneath your boots. A slow, tectonic groan. As if the continent itself is breathing. As if it is alive with something it refuses to release. Most people will never stand on that ice. Most people will never be permitted to. And that permission, or rather the systematic denial of it, is where our story truly begins. To understand what may lie beneath the ice shelf of Antarctica, we must first understand the audacity of a single piece of paper that surfaced in 1929 in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, Turkey. A fragment of gazelle skin, brittle with age, covered in hand-drawn coastlines and Arabic annotations. It was signed by a man named Hagji Ahmed Muhyiddin Piri, Admiral Piri Rise, and dated 1513 AD. The map depicted the Atlantic Ocean, the coasts of Africa, the coasts of South America, and at the very bottom, curving below the known world like a dark secret, was an unmistakable landmass. Scholars identified it immediately. It was Antarctica, not the Antarctica we see today, blanketed, smoothed, buried under an empire of ice, but subglacial Antarctica. The Antarctica that exists beneath the frozen surface, every bay, every inlet. Every mountain ridge confirmed by 20th century seismic mapping and satellite imaging conducted by the United States Geological Survey. Let that breathe for a moment. A Turkish admiral in the 16th century accurately charted a coastline that was hidden under 2 miles of ice. He did not claim it as his own discovery. In his own annotations on the map, Piri Rise wrote that he had compiled his chart from older source maps. Maps that no longer exist. Maps that came from a civilization or civilizations whose names we do not know and whose histories have never been written. The question is not whether the map is accurate. It has been confirmed. The question, the one that geographers and archaeologists have quietly argued about in academic journals and conference rooms for nearly a century, is who sailed that coast and when. Because Antarctica has not been ice-free in recorded human history. The last time its coastlines were exposed to open ocean and temperate air was approximately 12,000 years ago. Some geological models push that figure further, 15,000, even 20,000 years before the present. This was the tail end of the last great ice age, a period when the rest of the world's civilizations, by conventional academic reckoning, were just barely learning to plant wheat. And yet, someone had a navy, Someone had cartographic technology precise enough to map an entire subpolar coastline. Someone was sailing in waters that modern icebreakers still find treacherous. And they were doing it with enough regularity and competence to produce a document so accurate that it would take humanity another 5 centuries and the invention of radar to replicate it. We do not know who they were, but in 1958, the world may have found where they lived. The International Geophysical Year, a coordinated global scientific effort spanning 1957 to 1958, brought researchers from 67 nations together to study the planet's most extreme environments. Antarctica was a primary focus. The Soviets, locked in a Cold War competition that extended even into the most remote ice fields on Earth, deployed some of their most sophisticated geological instruments to the frozen interior of the continent, to a region so distant from the coast that it had never been meaningfully studied. What their equipment found, transmitted back in coded dispatches that were not declassified for decades, was a mountain range unlike anything science had anticipated. They named them the Gamburtsev subglacial mountains. The Gamburtsevs sit buried beneath 4 kilometers of Antarctic ice, invisible to the naked eye, unknowable without the kind of seismic-sounding technology that 1958 was only beginning to develop. When the data came back and geologists began to model what they had found, a troubling incongruity emerged, one that has never been satisfactorily explained, and that continues to generate heated debate in the journals of glaciology and geomorphology to this day. Mountains, when subjected to glacial pressure over geological timescales, we are talking tens of millions of years, undergo a predictable process of erosion. Glaciers are not passive. They are slow, grinding, inexorable machines of destruction, and over sufficient time, they reduce even the most jagged, dramatic peaks to gentle, rounded hills. The Alps, exposed to open air, retain their sharpness, but mountain ranges buried under continental ice sheets for tens of millions of years should be worn smooth, rounded, blunted by the relentless, crushing weight above them. The Gamburtsevs are not smooth, they are sharp, they are jagged. They are, in the words of the researchers who have studied them, remarkably well preserved, a phrase that sounds like scientific praise but carries the weight of a much more disturbing implication. Because remarkably well preserved means they have not been under that ice for nearly as long as they should have been. In geological terms, where 1,000,000 years is a rounding error, these mountains were buried recently, shockingly recently. The ice above them is ancient, but the relationship between the mountains and the ice is young in a way that does not fit any conventional model of Antarctic glaciation. Something happened. Something fast. Something that buried an entire interior mountain range under 4 kilometers of ice in what, by geological standards, amounts to the blink of an eye. And when you pair that anomaly with the fossil record, the picture that emerges is not merely strange. It is revolutionary. Antarctica is not barren. Beneath its ice, sealed in the rock and compressed sediment of its ancient geology, is a biological archive of staggering richness. Paleontologists working in the exposed coastal regions of the continent have recovered the fossilized remains of palm trees, true tropical palms, the kind that require sustained warmth and sunlight to survive. They have found the bones of dinosaurs, the impressions of ferns and cycads, the preserved traces of ecosystems that belong not in a polar desert but in a humid, sunlit, temperate world. These are not anomalies. They are not misidentifications. They are the incontrovertible, peer-reviewed, academically confirmed record of a continent that was, within geological memory, warm, green, alive. And if a continent can support palm trees and dinosaurs, it can support something else, something more recent. Something that looked up at a sky full of stars and thought to draw what it saw, to chart the coastlines it sailed, to build structures aligned to celestial bodies, structures that from above, from satellite altitude, bear an uncomfortable resemblance to something we recognize. The images emerged slowly, the way all forbidden things tend to emerge, through cracks, through amateur observers with telephoto lenses, through satellite footage that was public before someone decided it shouldn't be. They showed peaks, not buried peaks like the Gamburtsevs, but surface formations in the coastal and near-coastal regions of Antarctica, visible above the snow line. Three-sided, four-sided, unnervingly symmetrical peaks that cast angular shadows in the polar sunlight. Peaks that looked, to any untrained eye and to more than a few trained ones, like pyramids. The official explanation is pyramidal peaks, a natural geological process by which frost and wind erosion on multiple faces of a mountain create angular, symmetrical shapes over time. The Matterhorn in the Alps is often cited as a terrestrial example. It is a legitimate phenomenon. It is also, for some researchers, an explanation that arrived a little too quickly, a little too smoothly, a little too completely to close a door that had barely been opened. Because the theory that lives in the uncomfortable space beneath that official explanation draws on a hypothesis, first proposed seriously by Charles Hapgood in the 1950s. A theory that Albert Einstein himself found compelling enough to write a foreword for, though history has largely buried that endorsement alongside everything else inconvenient about this story. The theory is called Earth crustal displacement. Its premise is this: that the outer crust of the Earth, the lithospheric shell, is not rigidly fixed to the mantle beneath it, and that under conditions of sufficient mass imbalance, caused, perhaps, by the accumulation of enormous ice sheets at the poles, the entire crust can slip, rotating across the mantle like the skin of an orange rotating around the fruit itself. Continents do not move relative to each other in this model. The whole crust moves together. And if you run the mathematics backward, if you ask where Antarctica would have been positioned before such a displacement event, the answer places it significantly further north, in a temperate zone. In a zone where civilizations could have flourished, in a zone where someone could have built something. This is where the 1959 Antarctic Treaty enters the frame, and enters it badly. 12 nations, the United States, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, France, Argentina, Australia, and 6 others, signed the treaty on December 1, 1959. Its stated purpose was peaceful: to preserve Antarctica for scientific research, to prohibit military activity, to protect the environment. Noble goals, laudable goals. The treaty has been praised by international law scholars for 70 years, but consider the timing. The Gamburtsev Mountains were discovered in 1958. Fossils confirming Antarctica's tropical past had been recovered in 1958. The single most intensive, coordinated scientific survey of the Antarctic interior in human history had concluded in 1958. And within 12 months, the same nations that had conducted that survey locked the continent behind a legal framework that, regardless of its stated intentions, had the practical effect of preventing independent archaeological investigation. No private researcher, no independent archaeologist, no institution operating outside the framework of national scientific programs can simply go to Antarctica and dig. The continent is, uniquely in the world, governed by a treaty that makes meaningful independent excavation essentially impossible. What were they afraid of finding? Or what had they already found? There is no document. There is no whistleblower with a USB drive full of photographs of underground cities and alien artifacts. This is not that story because that story is too easy, and the truth, when it is genuinely strange, resists easy narratives. What we have instead are the fractures, The small, persistent, academically embarrassing fractures in the official version of events, each one individually explicable, but collectively forming a pattern that is very hard to dismiss. A map that should not exist, accurate beyond any 16th century capability. Mountains that should be smooth and are not. Fossils of tropical life in a frozen desert. Satellite images of symmetrical formations that official sources moved quickly to explain and then to stop discussing. A treaty signed in extraordinary haste by nations that were, in every other arena of human endeavor, mortal enemies. History, real history, not the history of textbooks and classroom timelines, but the deep history of this planet and the beings that have walked it, is not a straight line. It is not a triumphant march from primitive to sophisticated, from simple to complex, from darkness to light. It is a record interrupted by catastrophe, buried by ice and water and time, recovered in fragments so small and so scattered that the picture they form is legible only to those willing to look at the whole rather than the permitted parts. Antarctica holds something, the ice holds it, the treaty holds it. And beneath 4 kilometers of frozen silence, the Gamburtsev Mountains stand as sharp as the day they were buried, patient, impossible, waiting for someone with the courage to ask the question that every piece of evidence is screaming.